The crystalline platform hummed with a frequency that Theo Graves could feel in his back teeth, which was unfortunate because he'd been standing in this observation alcove for 2.5 hours, and his molars were starting to ache. He shifted his weight, the data pad in his hand displaying shipping manifests that were now completely useless since the ceremonial lockdown had sealed every exit from the Grand Hall. Somewhere in the administrative offices 3 levels down, his supervisor was probably having an aneurysm wondering why the quarterly freight summaries hadn't been delivered. The intersystem concordat station was beautiful in the way that things designed by committee to impress a dozen different species usually weren't. Massive viewports revealed the swirling colors of the Andromeda Gate, that peculiar fold in space where 3 star systems kissed close enough for real-time commerce. The ceiling arched 100 meters overhead, embedded with light panels that mimicked a sky none of them had ever seen. And in the center of it all, standing on a raised dais of what appeared to be compressed starlight, was the reason Theo couldn't leave. Queen Lyrene of the Velith Empire stood perfectly still in robes that caught every photon in the room and transformed it into cascading silver light. Even from this distance, Theo could see she was objectively stunning, though he suspected that was partly biological engineering and partly just good genetics. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders in waves that seemed to move independent of any breeze, and her amber eyes, currently fixed on some middle distance that suggested she was thinking about anything except the present moment, had an almost luminous quality. The ears were what marked her as Velith, sweeping back from her temples in elegant points that would have looked ridiculous on a human, but on her seemed perfectly natural, almost inevitable. She'd been standing there for 3 hours. Theo had been watching for most of it, initially out of boredom, then out of morbid fascination, and now out of something uncomfortably close to sympathy. The royal choosing ceremony was apparently a very big deal, which Theo had learned from the increasingly agitated whispers of the actual dignitaries trapped in observation with him. Representatives from 27 different worlds had been invited to approach the Queen, evaluate her suitability as a political partner, and either accept or reject the proposed union. So far, the score was rejections. 24 acceptances, 0 and diplomatic incidents narrowly avoided. 3. The current candidate was a Nethurian prince whose skin refracted light in oil-slick patterns. He circled the Queen like she was a used shuttle he was considering purchasing, which seemed to be the standard approach. His translator unit projected his verdict in a dozen languages simultaneously. The Velith Empire's resource deficit makes this union untenable. I must decline. Lyrene's expression didn't change. She inclined her head exactly 15 degrees. Theo had started measuring, and said something in return that the translation systems rendered as formal gratitude for his consideration. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the ceremonial staff she held, a slim rod of what looked like crystallized starlight that matched the platform beneath her feet. The prince retreated. The ceremony master, a bureaucratic concordat official whose species Theo couldn't identify beneath all the formal robes, announced in a voice like grinding gears that 3 candidates remained. Theo glanced at his data pad. The shipping manifest stared back at him accusingly. He'd been hired 6 months ago to coordinate freight logistics between Earth's merchant fleet and the Concordat stations, a job that was supposed to be boring, safe, and entirely free of political drama. He was extremely good at his job because he treated interstellar commerce like the massive puzzle it was, everything connected, every delay cascaded, every solution required seeing 3 moves ahead. Unfortunately, being good at logistics didn't help when you were trapped in a ceremonial hall watching what was essentially a very slow, very public rejection. The next candidate approached. This one was human, actually, which surprised Theo. Ambassador Wei from the Sino Collective, dressed in adaptive fabric that probably cost more than Theo's annual salary. Wei walked around the Queen once, nodded politely, and delivered his rejection in Mandarin that the translators caught and disseminated. While we respect the Velith people's contributions to art and philosophy, the current political instability makes this alliance inadvisable. Something in Theo's chest tightened. It was the way Lyrine's shoulders had started to curve inward, just slightly, like someone learning to fold themselves smaller. She still held her composure, still maintained that diplomatic mask, but 3 hours of public rejection were clearly taking their toll. The second-to-last candidate was from the Crystalline Collective, a being that looked like someone had taught geometry to grow legs. The rejection was delivered in harmonic frequencies that made Theo's fillings buzz. The translation: incompatible resource matrices and insufficient territorial holdings. 1 candidate left. The final noble was from the Merchant Moons, a confederation of trading stations that had gotten obscenely wealthy by charging tolls on 3 major shipping lanes. He was humanoid, corpulent in a way that suggested wealth rather than health, and wearing enough precious metals that he clinked when he walked. His name was something like Gordex Vane, though Theo might have misheard over the general murmur of the crowd. Gordex didn't bother circling. He stood 5 meters from the Queen and looked her up and down like she was a balance sheet that didn't add up. A curiosity at best, his translator projected, his voice dripping with an amusement that needed no translation. A liability at worst. The Velith Empire is a sinking ship, Your Majesty, and I'm not fool enough to tie my fortune to wreckage. He actually laughed, a wet sound that carried across the hall. I decline, obviously. He turned his back on her. Didn't bow, didn't acknowledge the ceremony, just turned and waddled back toward the observation sections, still chuckling. The ceremony master stepped forward, preparing to speak. Lyrine stood alone on her platform of compressed light, surrounded by the representatives of 27 worlds who had all found her wanting. Her amber eyes were fixed on something beyond the viewports, somewhere in the darkness between stars. Theo looked at his data pad, looked at the shipping manifests that didn't matter, looked at the Queen who had stood with impossible dignity through 3 hours of systematic humiliation. Then, before his brain could properly communicate with his legs about what a catastrophically stupid idea this was, Theo Graves stepped forward. The security protocols squawked immediately. Red warning lights flashed in his peripheral vision. But the ceremonial lockdown that had trapped him here also meant the security drones couldn't move fast enough to stop him before he crossed the sacred boundary between observers and participants. His knee hit the crystalline platform with a crack that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. He looked up at Queen Lyrine, whose amber eyes had gone wide with something between shock and confusion. I'm no noble, Theo said, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm a freight coordinator from Earth who got stuck here because your ceremony master has apparently never heard of emergency exit protocols. But I've watched you stand up here for 3 hours with more grace than anyone in this room has shown, and I figure that counts for something. He could hear the ceremony master sputtering behind him. Someone in the crowd was arguing about regulations, but Theo kept his eyes on the Queen. So if you'll have a guy who spends most of his time arguing about shipping container configurations and can barely remember which fork to use at formal dinners, Your Majesty, I'm offering. Can't promise I won't embarrass you at parties, but I can promise I'll show up. Lyrine stared at him. For a long moment nothing happened. Then she smiled and it transformed her entire face. I accept. The medical scanner made a sound like a distressed songbird having an argument with a refrigerator, which Theo decided probably wasn't good. The concordat physician, a being whose species looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a floor lamp, adjusted something on the hovering diagnostic panel and clicked its mandibles in what the translator rendered as, interesting. That's never a phrase you want to hear from a doctor, Theo said. Lying on what he'd been assured was an examination table, but felt more like a sheet of sentient gelatin. Right up there with oops, and we'll need to call in a specialist. Your genetic structure is more resilient than expected. the physician said, which didn't exactly answer Theo's concern. The compatibility markers are within acceptable parameters for biological cohabitation, though I recommend avoiding Velith ceremonial wine. Your liver would interpret it as a direct attack. Noted. No getting drunk at my own wedding. That'll make the speeches easier anyway. The physician made another adjustment, and the scanner cycled through a spectrum of lights that probably meant something important to someone who wasn't currently being analyzed at the molecular level. Through the transparent wall of the medical bay, Theo could see the aftermath of what his supervisor would probably call catastrophic career deviation. The Grand Hall had devolved into controlled chaos approximately 8 seconds after Queen Lyrene had accepted his offer. Ambassadors had clustered into arguing groups. The ceremony master had actually fainted, which seemed excessive, but perhaps was standard for ceremonial officials dealing with unprecedented protocol violations. And somewhere in the administrative levels, Theo's supervisor was definitely having that aneurysm. The door to the medical bay dilated open with a pneumatic hiss, and 3 people entered with the coordinated efficiency of a tactical unit. The first was a Velith man who carried himself like someone who'd seen too much and stopped being surprised by anything years ago. His ears were slightly shorter than Lyrene's, swept back at a more aggressive angle, and his eyes were a darker amber that suggested autumn rather than summer. He wore practical travel clothes rather than ceremonial robes, and the way his hand rested near his belt suggested weapons within easy reach. "Saren," the physician acknowledged. "Your queen's new consort is biologically compatible, if concerningly fragile." "I'm right here," Theo said, and I resent the fragile comment. "I've survived 3 station decompression drills and a cargo bay fire." "Congratulations," Saren said, his voice flat. "You're engaged to a queen whose cousin tried to assassinate her twice last year. The cargo bay fire might have been better preparation than you think." The second person was a human woman who looked like she'd been born wearing a business suit and had never quite figured out how to relax. Her dark hair was pulled back severely enough to qualify as a structural engineering feat, and she carried a data pad that she consulted with the intensity of someone reading tactical reports rather than scheduling notes. "Myra Okonkwo," she introduced herself, not looking up from the pad. "Protocol officer. I've been assigned to prevent you from causing 17 more diplomatic incidents before the actual union ceremony. The running bet among the delegation is currently whether you'll make it to 12 or hit 20. What are the odds? Heavily in favor of 20. You stepped on the Nethurian ambassador's shadow projection during the security processing. That's considered a challenge to mortal combat in their culture." "His what now?" "We smoothed it over. Barely." Myra finally looked up, her expression suggesting she was already exhausted by his existence. "The union ceremony is in 3 standard days. During that time, you and Queen Lyrene are required by concordat tradition to spend a minimum of 4 hours together per day in what they're calling the bonding period, which is essentially speed dating for political marriages." The third person was Velith, female, with silver-threaded hair and ears that swept back so elegantly they seemed to defy physics. She wore robes that managed to look both formal and practical, embroidered with symbols that probably meant something to people who understood Velith heraldry. Her amber eyes assessed Theo with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent years evaluating threats and opportunities. "Kelly's," she said simply, "senior advisor to Queen Lyrene. I've served her family for 23 standard years, survived a civil war, 3 assassination attempts, and a diplomatic reception where the Crystalline Collective served beverages that were technically sentient. I mention this so you understand that if you hurt her, disappoint her, or waste her time, the universe contains hiding places you cannot imagine, but I will find you anyway." "That's very clear, thank you," Theo said. "Should I be writing this down, or is the death threat implied in all future interactions?" Kelly's mouth twitched, which might have been approval or indigestion. The Queen accepted you for reasons I don't yet understand. My job is to determine whether those reasons have merit, or if she made a decision based on emotional exhaustion and 3 hours of systematic humiliation. Probably the second thing, Theo admitted. I mean, I literally got stuck here because I was delivering shipping manifests during ceremonial lockdown. This wasn't some grand romantic gesture. I just thought it was objectively terrible that everyone was treating her like expired merchandise. Yes, Kelly said, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. It was. The physician completed its scan, and the table released Theo with a sensation like peeling off a particularly clingy wetsuit. He sat up, accepted the clothes that Myra thrust at him with military efficiency, and tried to process the fact that he'd gone from freight coordinator to alien queen's consort in under 4 hours. The Queen is currently in diplomatic meetings, Kelly said. Apparently your stunt has created what the Concordat is calling unprecedented political complications, which is bureaucratic code for nobody knows what happens next. You're scheduled to meet with her at the 19th hour for the first official bonding session. What do people even do during bonding sessions? Talk, usually, Saren said. Try not to reveal deal-breaking personality flaws. Avoid discussing past relationships, politics, or whether you believe in certain fundamental aspects of reality. Standard first date material, but with more legal documents. Myra consulted her data pad. You'll need coaching before then. Your posture is wrong. Your dialect of standard is informal to the point of insulting in 12 different cultures, and you apparently think appropriate greeting gestures are optional rather than mandatory. I waved at the Nethurian ambassador. That's friendly. You waved through his shadow projection, which is the equivalent of reaching through someone's soul to scratch your nose. We're lucky he didn't challenge you immediately. How was I supposed to know that? Exactly, Myra said, as if Theo had just proven her point. We have 3 days to teach you enough diplomatic protocol that you don't accidentally start a war before the ceremony. The Velith Empire has enough problems without adding consort-triggered interstellar conflict through aggressive waving to the list. Theo looked at the 3 of them. This unlikely delegation that served a queen most of the known systems had just rejected. Saren with his hand never far from weapons, Myra with her exhausted competence, Kelly's with her protective ferocity barely contained beneath diplomatic courtesy. So what you're saying is, I should probably apologize to my supervisor now because I'm not getting back to the shipping manifests anytime soon. Your employment contract was legally suspended the moment you crossed the ceremonial boundary, Myra said. Congratulations. You're technically unemployed, engaged to alien royalty, and wanted for questioning by the Nethurian diplomatic corps. Welcome to politics. Fantastic, Theo said. This is exactly how I imagine my Tuesday going. Kelly's almost smiled. The Queen will meet you in the Garden of Reflected Stars at the 19th hour. Try not to insult anyone between now and then. No promises, Theo said, and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. The Garden of Reflected Stars turned out to be less of a garden and more of a carefully engineered optical illusion involving mirrors, artificial gravity wells, and what Theo suspected were actual captured photons suspended in stasis fields. Plants from a dozen different worlds grew in impossible configurations, spiraling upward in defiance of physics, their leaves catching light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The air smelled like ozone and something floral that his brain kept trying to classify as jasmine, but knew wasn't quite right. Theo arrived early, which Myra had assured him was the only acceptable option since arriving on time would be interpreted as casual disrespect by at least 4 different cultures represented in the Concordat. He'd spent the last 3 hours being lectured on proper posture, appropriate conversation topics, and the 17 different ways he could accidentally propose marriage to the wrong species if he gestured with his left hand instead of his right. Queen Lyrene was already there, standing beside a fountain that defied gravity by flowing upward in a spiral before dispersing into mist. She'd changed from her ceremonial robes into something simpler, though simple was apparently relative when you were royalty. The fabric still caught light in ways that seemed designed by someone who understood physics better than nature did, and her dark hair was bound back with what looked like crystallized starlight woven into a braid. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and Theo was struck again by those amber eyes and the elegant sweep of her ears. For approximately the 1000th time that day, his brain helpfully reminded him that he'd knelt before this woman and offered himself as a consort based on 3 hours of observation and a vague sense that someone needed to do something. "Theo Graves," she said, and his name sounded different in her voice, like she was tasting each syllable. "Thank you for coming. I mean, technically I'm contractually obligated now, but you're welcome," Theo said, then immediately remembered Myra's lecture about appropriate formality levels and wondered if he'd already failed. "Your Majesty," Lyrine's mouth curved into something that might have been amusement. "We're engaged to be politically bonded, and you've already knelt at my feet in front of representatives from 27 worlds. I think we can dispense with excessive formality when we're alone." That's a relief, because Myra spent an hour trying to teach me the difference between formal greetings and casual greetings, and I'm pretty sure I retained none of it. But Myra is excellent at her job, which unfortunately means she assumes everyone can absorb diplomatic protocol through sheer force of repetition and disapproval. Lyrine moved away from the fountain, gesturing for him to follow her along a path that wound between plants that definitely shouldn't be growing in the same environment. "Kelly's told me you compared yourself to expired merchandise." "I said everyone was treating you like expired merchandise, not that you were. Important distinction. But accurate." She paused beside something that looked like a tree had decided to become a spiral staircase. The Velith Empire was once a significant power. 15 systems, trade routes that connected the inner colonies to the outer territories, a cultural heritage that dated back 7,000 years. Then my cousin Vex decided he wanted the throne more than he wanted family, and suddenly we were down to 3 systems, minimal military capacity, and a queen nobody wanted to align with. Your advisor mentioned assassination attempts. 2 confirmed, 3 suspected but unproven. Vex is nothing if not persistent. Lyrine touched one of the spiral branches and it lit from within, bioluminescence spreading like fire through crystalline veins. The royal choosing was supposed to be my way back. Marry into a stronger empire, bring their resources and protection to my people, rebuild what was lost. Instead, I stood there for 3 hours learning exactly how irrelevant the Velith have become. Theo watched the light spread through the tree that wasn't a tree and tried to figure out what you said to someone who just summarized the political collapse of their civilization. Myra's protocol lessons definitely hadn't covered this. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "that merchant moon guy was a condescending ass, and I'm pretty sure at least half those nobles rejected you because they were terrified you were smarter than them." Lyrine laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was startling in its genuineness. "You think I frightened them? You stood there for 3 hours with perfect composure, while they circled you like you were a math problem they couldn't solve. Yeah, I think they were scared. Nobody maintains that kind of dignity unless they're either completely broken or incredibly dangerous, and you didn't look broken." "I felt broken, but you weren't, that's the point." They walked in silence for a moment, past plants that hummed with energy and flowers that bloomed in colors Theo's eyes couldn't quite process. The garden's artificial sky cycled through something that resembled sunset on a world Theo had never visited, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. "Why did you kneel?" Lyrine asked suddenly. "Kelly's has 17 theories. Myra thinks you're either brilliantly calculating or catastrophically stupid, and Saren is reserving judgment until he determines whether you're a threat." Honestly, I was bored, stuck, and annoyed. I've been standing there for hours watching people treat you like you didn't matter, and it seemed like someone should do something. Plus my knee gave out a little from standing too long, so the kneeling part was at least 50% accidental. You offered to bond with the queen of a dying empire because your knee gave out. When you phrase it like that, it sounds worse than it was. Lyrene stopped walking and turned to face him fully. You're either the most honest person I've met or the best liar, and I genuinely cannot tell which. Definitely the first one. I'm a terrible liar. My supervisor figured out I was hungover last month because apparently I squint differently when I'm dehydrated. You got hungover and still came to work. Shipping manifests don't care about your poor life choices. The freight still needs coordinating. Something shifted in Lyrene's expression, a tension easing that Theo hadn't realized was there. Kelly's thinks I accepted you because I was emotionally compromised by 3 hours of systematic rejection. She told me that. Also threatened to hunt me across the universe if I disappoint you, which seems like a reasonable response from a loyal advisor. And what do you think? Why did I accept? Theo considered this, watching the way the garden's light caught in her hair and reflected in those amber eyes. I think you saw someone who looked at you and saw a person instead of a political equation. And I think after 3 hours of being evaluated like a balance sheet, that probably mattered. Lyrene held his gaze for a long moment. I also think you're more clever than you pretend to be. Freight coordinators don't usually quote political philosophy in their spontaneous proposals. I didn't quote philosophy, I just said you had dignity. You said I had more grace than anyone in the room. That's from Talvin's Principles of Leadership, Chapter 7. Grace under observation reveals more than power in action. Is it? I might have read that in university, or possibly overheard it at a bar. The line between education and eavesdropping gets fuzzy after enough time. You read Talvin's Principles. I read a lot of things. Freight coordination involves a lot of waiting around for customs officials to process paperwork. You develop hobbies. Lyrene smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. The bonding period is supposed to help us determine compatibility, whether we can stand each other's company for more than ceremonial appearances, whether this alliance has any chance of functioning beyond political necessity. And I think you're either going to be the best decision I've made in years, or the most interesting mistake of my life. I'm hoping for option 1, but honestly prepared for option 2. That, Lyrene said, is perhaps the most diplomatic thing you've said since we met. They continued walking, talking about nothing and everything, past plants that shouldn't exist and under stars that weren't real, while somewhere in the Concordat's administrative levels, people argued about protocols and precedents. But in the garden of reflected stars, a queen and a freight coordinator learned to navigate the space between political necessity and genuine connection, one awkward conversation at a time. The tribunal chamber was designed to intimidate, which Theo supposed made sense for a place where they decided the fates of empires. Circular walls rose 30 meters overhead, embedded with observation platforms where representatives from the Concordat's member systems watched like ravens waiting for something to die. The acoustics were engineered to carry every word to every corner, which meant there was nowhere to hide from your own voice, your own arguments, your own potential failures. Thea sat beside Lyrene at the central platform, acutely aware that he was wearing formal robes that Myra had assured him were appropriate, but felt like someone had wrapped him in decorative curtains. Across from them, Lord Vex occupied his own platform with the confidence of someone who'd already decided he'd won. Vex was Velith, with the same elegant ears and amber eyes as Lyrene, but where she carried herself with careful dignity, he projected casual arrogance. His robes were cut to display wealth rather than tradition, threaded with metals that caught the light aggressively. He'd arrived at the Concordat 2 days ago with a military fleet, legal documentation, and a smile that made Theo want to check his pockets for missing valuables. The claim is straightforward, Vex was saying, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Queen Lyrene has bonded with a commoner, a human freight coordinator with no noble lineage, no political connections, and no legitimate claim to share rule of a Velith empire. By the ancient laws of our people, this union invalidates her right to the throne. The Velith worlds deserve a legitimate ruler, not a desperate queen making alliances with whoever happens to kneel first. The Concordat Arbiter, a being whose species looked like someone had given a mathematical equation physical form, consulted holographic documents that floated in geometric patterns around its platform. Queen Lyrene, you wish to contest this claim. Lyrene stood, and Theo was reminded of watching her during the choosing ceremony. That same perfect composure even as everything crumbled around her. I contest both the legal interpretation and the fundamental premise. The ancient laws Lord Vex references were written 7,000 years ago, when the Velith Empire consisted of a single planet and political marriages were arranged between tribal leaders. We have evolved beyond such constraints, as has our understanding of what constitutes legitimate rule. Yet tradition remains tradition, Vex said smoothly. You cannot simply discard thousands of years of precedent because it becomes inconvenient. I'm not discarding precedent. I'm arguing that precedent must adapt to circumstance, which is itself a tradition of Velith governance dating back to the Reform Council of the Fourth Era. Citing the Reform Council is convenient for someone who wishes to break every rule that constrains them. Kelly's, sitting in the advisor section behind them, passed Theo a data pad with a note written across the top. Let them argue law for another 10 minutes, then present the documents. Theo glanced at the data pad's contents, the result of 3 days spent doing what he actually knew how to do, following the logistics trail. While Lyrene and her advisors had prepared legal arguments, Theo had requested shipping manifests, trade records, and financial transactions from the Concordat's public archives. Myra had called it a waste of time. Saren had called it optimistically naive. But Kelly's had quietly provided him with access codes and told him that sometimes the most dangerous weapons were boring documents nobody bothered to read. The Arbiter allowed Lyrene and Vex to trade legal precedents for another 8 minutes before interrupting. Both arguments have merit within their interpretive frameworks. However, the tribunal must consider not only law but also practical governance. Lord Vex, you claim to be the legitimate ruler of the Velith Empire. What evidence supports your capacity to govern? I have restored order to 12 systems, Vex said. Rebuilt our military capacity, established new trade agreements, and brought prosperity back to worlds that were failing under uncertain leadership. The Velith people support me because I deliver results, not empty promises. Interesting, Theo said, standing up before his brain could fully process what his mouth was doing. Can I ask a question about those results? The Arbiter's geometric patterns shifted, which might have been surprise. The consort wishes to speak. If that's allowed, I'm new to tribunals, still figuring out when it's appropriate to raise my hand. Vex's smile sharpened. By all means, let the freight coordinator speak. I'm curious what contribution someone of his background could possibly make to legitimate legal proceedings. Theo activated the data pad, and holographic displays materialized above the central platform. So I was looking at your trade agreements, Lord Vex, because that's kind of my thing. I'm very interested in who ships what and where it goes, and I noticed something interesting about your restored prosperity. I'm sure you did, Vex said, his tone suggesting Theo was about to embarrass himself. Your military expansion over the past 18 months required significant weapons procurement. Plasma cannons, shield generators, fighter-class vessels. The weird part is that none of it came from legitimate arms dealers registered with the Concordat. Instead, your supply chain traces back to 17 shell companies operating out of the Kureth Syndicate's territories. The chamber's murmur shifted in frequency. The Kurath Syndicate was a name that carried weight, none of it good. Vex's expression didn't change. Trade with frontier territories is not illegal. No, but trade with an organization explicitly sanctioned by the Concordat for trafficking in illegal weapons, conducting piracy operations, and undermining legitimate governments is super illegal. I checked. There's a whole section in the commercial code about it. Theo expanded the holographic display, showing shipping routes that connected Vex's empire to Kurath operations like a web of incriminating evidence. Here's the interesting part. You didn't just buy weapons. You sold them information. Transit schedules for Concordat security patrols, maps of shipping lanes, access codes for commercial stations. You essentially gave the Kurath Syndicate everything they needed to raid 3 different systems over the past year. These are fabrications, Vex said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. They're shipping manifests. Boring, detailed, incredibly specific shipping manifests with authentication codes, timestamps, and captain signatures. I've got 73 separate transactions documented here, all routing through your shell companies, all connecting back to accounts you personally authorized. Kelly stood, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. The Concordat has been attempting to dismantle the Kurath Syndicate for 15 standard years. Lord Vex hasn't just violated Velith law, he's violated Concordat sanctions and directly facilitated criminal operations that have cost thousands of lives. The Arbiter's geometric patterns accelerated, cycling through configurations that suggested rapid data processing. Lord Vex, you will submit to immediate investigation. Your fleet is hereby impounded pending tribunal review. Your claim to Velith leadership is suspended until these allegations are resolved. Vex's composure finally cracked. You're going to believe a freight coordinator's conspiracy theory over documented governance. I'm going to believe authenticated shipping records, the Arbiter said, which, as it happens, are rather difficult to fabricate. Security forces materialized from the chamber's entry points, moving toward Vex's platform with the efficiency of people who'd practiced this scenario. Vex looked at Lyrene and something in his expression shifted from arrogance to genuine hatred. You won't last, he said quietly. Even without me, the Empire is dying. You're just delaying the inevitable. Lyrene met his gaze without flinching. Perhaps, but I'll delay it with integrity, which is more than you ever managed. They escorted Vex out, his protests fading as the chamber doors sealed behind him. The Arbiter turned to Lyrene, its geometric patterns settling into something that might have been approval. Queen Lyrene, your union with Theo Graves is recognized as legitimate by Concordat authority. Your claim to Velith leadership is upheld. Furthermore, your cooperation in exposing Lord Vex's criminal activities has earned consideration for restored Concordat support to your empire. Lyrene bowed, the gesture containing relief she was too well trained to express verbally. The Velith people thanked the Concordat for its wisdom. They left the tribunal chamber together, trailed by Kellys, Myra, and Saren. In the corridor outside, away from observation platforms and formal acoustics, Lyrene finally let herself smile. You spent 3 days reading shipping manifests. It's literally my job, was my job. I'm still figuring out the employment situation. You took down my cousin with freight documentation and some light financial forensics. Also, Kelly's helped with the access codes, which I feel like doesn't get mentioned enough. Saren clapped Theo on the shoulder, nearly knocking him into a wall. I misjudged you. Anyone who can weaponize commercial logistics has earned my respect. Does this mean you'll stop checking my background for assassination attempts? Absolutely not, but I'll do it with admiration. Myra was already coordinating their departure, talking rapidly into a communication device about shuttle schedules and diplomatic notifications. We leave for Velith Prime in 6 hours. I'm scheduling press briefings, coordination with local governance, and approximately 47 meetings that cannot be avoided. Thea, you'll need another protocol briefing before we arrive. Can it wait until after I process the fact that I just helped arrest an emperor? No. Kelly's walked beside Lyrene, her expression carrying something that might have been pride. Your parents would have been impressed, both with your legal arguments and your choice of consort. They would have thought I was insane. That too, but impressed regardless. They reached the docking levels where Lyrene's ship waited, an elegant vessel that somehow managed to look both ancient and impossibly advanced. Theo paused at the boarding ramp, looking back at the Concordat station where 4 days ago he'd been delivering shipping manifests and complaining about ceremonial lockdowns. You're thinking this is insane, Lyrene said, standing beside him. I'm thinking I knelt down because my knee hurt and now I'm married to a queen, helped arrest a criminal emperor, and I'm flying off to help rebuild a civilization. So yeah, moderately insane. Do you regret it? Theo considered this, watching the station traffic moving in its endless patterns, ships arriving and departing like blood cells in some vast mechanical organism. Ask me again after Myra's protocol briefing. If I survive that, I'll probably survive anything. Lyrene laughed, took his hand, and led him up the ramp. Behind them, the Concordat station continued its eternal rotation, processing the endless complexity of intersystem politics and commerce. Ahead, Velith Prime waited with all its challenges and possibilities. Theo decided he'd figure it out the same way he figured out everything else, one step at a time, with occasional humor, and maybe by reading the documentation everyone else ignored. It wasn't a bad strategy for rebuilding an empire.